Welcome to the 2023 Toronto Mayoral elections coverage and overview. If you, like me, have no idea what's going on, this video is for you. The reason I made this video is that I keep hearing about different candidates and I have no idea what they have to offer. Every now and then they come on the news and they offer a certain policy. I don't really know how it fits into the wider framework and how they compare against their candidates. So hopefully this video, albeit kind of long, will serve as a good solid overview and an analysis into like what each candidate offers and what they're presenting as key policy, key policy changes and offerings and what they want to do. So this is not meant to be a fully comprehensive guide into what each candidate offers. What I've done is taken 6 candidates, analyzed their biggest policies, and kind of delved into them. This is not meant to be a partisan, analysis on like who I think is the best or who I think is the worst or who you should vote for. This is meant to remind you to go vote, go register to vote. You should do it right now, right after this intro is done. And you should also just take a look at what these candidates have to offer so you're a bit more informed in the decision you're about to make, because these decisions are critical. It'll change the way that the city is going and the direction that we're heading in. So hopefully this will be a good guide to understanding, overall what's happening with the top 6 candidates in the city and what they present to be their platform according to their own platform websites. I've essentially copy pasted everything that they've had to offer and compiled them into one thing. So feel free to watch this. There's slides. Feel free to listen to this in the background. Do whatever you need to do. But I think hopefully this will be useful. And if it is useful, leave a like, comment, share, leave something in the comments, and let me know what you think. So our agenda for today, in terms of actually looking at what the elections have to offer and what's going on, is that we're going to go through this step-by-step process. So we're going to go through an introduction, we're going to go through the municipal elections as a whole, essentially who cares about municipal elections and really why should we care about them. We're going to look at the top 6 candidates, we're going to look at their platforms, and we're going to do a bit of a summary, and then we're going to have some personal observations as to how I feel about them personally, and provide some more insight regarding that. So I think it's important to preface that before we really get into this analysis is that I am very much a layman. I am just an average citizen from Toronto, and I'm not an expert, nor a lawyer, nor a political analyst. So all of these platforms and the information is really taken directly from the candidate's website. So I haven't really done any extrapolation in terms of, guessing what they might say. What I've done is essentially gone to each one of their websites, coded what they said, and written it down on these slides just so we can have one distinct place, one place to actually go and get the information from. Because oftentimes we hear pieces on the news and each person is saying one thing or another, and it's really hard to keep track of who's saying what. So hopefully this compilation of information will be useful. So the specifics would change in terms of how they're going to implement their policies, I imagine. But the main idea is this early on hopefully won't be abandoned. Perhaps an idea that they introduce later on in June, that might be abandoned because they might, figure out that, hey, there's a different idea, we can use something else. But hopefully and ideally, these core tenets that they're proposing this early on won't change at all. So this is something that we're hopefully going to see. This is really what they're basing their campaigns on. So municipal elections are in a little bit of a dilemma in the sense that nobody really cares about them. Oddly enough, nobody, compared to federal politics, compared to provincial politics, far fewer people actually vote in municipal elections. And the reason for that is, well, nobody, I guess nobody really cares about the nitty-gritty of day-to-day life. But the dilemma here is that day-to-day politics will impact your life more often than federal issues do. Problems like national defense and fisheries and oceans are important, but the bus and the bike lanes and traffic lights and taxes, those things are stuff that you're going to interact with on a daily basis, and fewer people care about them because truthfully they're just seemingly not as sexy or really not as interesting as things like national defense or natural resources or our federal policies towards other countries, things like that. So here's the data on last year's municipal election. So we see that 29.7% of people actually bothered to vote in the 2022 Toronto mayoral elections, in which John Tory won, and then he quit. He resigned. A little bit of a scandal was had there, and currently about 30% of people are undecided. And then the paradox here is that you actually interact with municipal issues far more often than federal or provincial issues, yet 66% of people cast a ballot in the 2021 federal elections, pointing out that, federal elections people are more interested in. The other issue is that since mayoral and municipal elections, at least in Ontario, are non-partisan in the sense that each individual is a candidate and not necessarily, backed by a party element, it's a lot harder to align with an individual's message than identifying yourself as a wholly conservative or wholly NDP. The odds of you actually reading an independent MP's forum or NDP's candidate structure is far less likely than actually going through all of these Toronto candidates and seeing what they have to offer on an individual basis rather than aligning yourself with whatever party they claim to be associated with. So let's get into the candidates. At the time of closing of the registration forms, there were over 100 registered candidates for the 2023 Toronto mayoral elections, but we're really going to only look at the top 6 by polling, because it's most likely that among these 6, they're going to become the mayor, and honestly, there's a lot of unhinged, crazy people out of the 100 ones, and I have no interest in getting into them, and I'm sure you also have no interest in analyzing some of their policies. Maybe we'll do a later video on, looking at the most you know, um, unrealistic policies that some of these candidates have to offer. But we're only going to look at the top 6 for now for the sake of time and also for the sake of purposes of this video. So here are our candidates. So from top left all the way to right, we've got Olivia Chow, who is our former NDP MP for Trinity Spadina. We've got Josh Matlow, who is a former city councillor. We've got Mark Saunders, the former police chief of said Toronto. Anna Bailao, who is a former deputy mayor, Bradford, who is also the former city planner of Toronto, and then Mitzie Hunter, who's a former Liberal MPP out in Guildwood and Scarborough. So we've got a wide spectrum of really political inclinations and beliefs, and really a wide spectrum of people in certain professions. But there's clearly a tunnel that we've got here. Everyone here has been in a public job of some form, of some sort, whether that be directly in politics or be associated with government as a public servant of some kind. So we've got those three: city councillor, police chief, city planner. Those are definitely public servants. And we've got MP, MPP, and deputy mayor. Those are more political kind of positions, but still, with the goal of serving the public, ideally, at least. So a little bit of a biography on Olivia Chow. So she was the NDP MP for Trinity Spadina from 2006 to 2014. She ran for the mayor of Toronto in 2014, but then came in third behind Ford and John Tory. Remember Rob Ford? Seems like Toronto can't have a mayor without some sort of scandal, so maybe Olivia Chow will be the first one to be scandalous. She was first elected in 1985 as a school board trustee, so that's for the Toronto District School Board, and she normally categorizes herself as a center-left candidate. For the rest of her backstory and personal life, and then relation to Jack Layton, who was the federal leader of the NDP party, what I would do is go to Wikipedia and read up on it, because honestly, that it was going to offer far more insight and far more in depth that I'm going to fit on the slide, and really it's not super important for the purpose of this video, which is analyzing her policies and what she brings to the table. Josh Matlow. So he was a Toronto City Councillor for Ward 12, Toronto St. Paul, since 2010. So has been in there for a while. He was first elected in 2003 as a TDSB trustee, and he's consistently been endorsed by the Toronto Star, the leading publication in Toronto, in 2010, 2014, 2018, and 2022. He dubs himself as a pragmatic progressive, so those air quotes are his direct quotes that I pulled from the website / Twitter / wherever those emerged from. But you can Google it. He was there. Wikipedia for his personal life and etc. Once again, not super critical for our purposes here, but if you're interested, you could always see his voting record on Toronto City Council and see how that lines up with the policies that he is yet to offer. But the goal of this guide is not to be a biography for each one of these candidates, but to essentially say what they see. See what they say, and try and get some insight on and compile what's going on. So we got Mark Saunders, who's an interesting candidate. He was the former Toronto Chief of Police from April 26, 2015 to July 31st, 2020. 2020 being a big year for the Black Lives Matter movement to kick off. But Mark Saunders said that that was unrelated in terms of why he retired. He said he was retiring for family reasons. So, you can interpret that however you wish. He was the former PC candidate for Don Valley West in the 2022 Ontario election, and he was named the province's special advisor to the Ontario Place redevelopment, and he held a 37-plus year career with the Toronto Police Services. Yeah, that's him. He's a police chief, so his whole thing is going to be focusing on community safety, more policing, that kind of thing. So we'll take a look at what he has to offer later. But I think it's interesting that he was the former PC candidate for Don Valley West, and the PC being the Progressive Conservatives, and now so the same party as Doug Ford, who's the current Premier of Ontario, and now he is heading into municipal politics. Anna Bailao, she was the Toronto City Councillor for Davenport on from 2010 until 2022. She was also the Deputy Mayor of Toronto from 2017 to 2022, so that's East York and Toronto was her jurisdiction that she was sitting over. I imagine the city's divided into a few segments and quadrants, and that's essentially what she was handling. She sat on the Exec Committee and sat as Chair for Planning and Housing. So the Deputy Mayor portfolio really included the responsibility for housing. So we're curious as to what she has to offer for housing and the affordability crisis that's ongoing in Toronto. She resigned from a real estate company called Dream Unlimited in January 2023 as the head of said affordable housing because of conflict of interest now that she's running as mayor of Toronto, so that makes sense. And she was the one who introduced a vacant homes tax in Toronto, so essentially saying that if your home is vacant, aka if it's empty and nobody's living in there, then you could be subject to a 1% tax on said home. Some advocates have asked for this tax to go up to 3%. So the goal of this tax, I imagine, is to really remove the amount of just empty homes bought by investors off the market and try and incentivize investors to rent out these homes or sell them so that there's more supply in the market. Bradford, who has an incredible name, and he goes into depth about this on his Twitter account, so go see that. This is not an endorsement. I have no interest in supporting any of these candidates at this point in time. I've really made this video because I have no idea what each person offers, and I figured many of you are in a similar position. So, he was the former city planner for Toronto. He was elected in 2018, endorsed by Tory, Bailao, Potts, and more. So, a bit of the old guard support. Chair of the Affordable Planning and Housing Committee. And he's got a lot of cross-political spectrum pollination, which I think is very interesting. So you've got Matt Hiraishi, who was the former chief of staff to Stephen Lecce, who is currently the Progressive Conservatives Education Minister. You may recognize Stephen Lecce by Googling his name and then seeing what comes up in the news. Yeah, there's some interesting stuff. Advised by Liberals Kokan Abbas and former Liberal candidate Andrea Barak. So we've got essentially, the Conservative leadership, Liberal leadership, and he was also advised by PC strategists for the Doug Ford campaigns. The Doug Ford, current Premier of Ontario, Conservative Premier of Ontario. So Bradford clearly has got quite a lot of either support or networks across the political spectrum. So that's interesting. Mitzie Hunter, so she is quite close by to me geographically, in Scarborough. So she is the former MPP for Scarborough Guildwood since 2013. I believe she's resigned since because, conflict of interest. She was a provincial cabinet minister from 2014 2018, so that's interesting. So she's got experience in handling provincial politics and understanding, the machinations of how provinces work, and, decreeing things and implementing acts and statutes and all that kind of stuff. She was the Minister of Education in 2016, and she was the former CEO of Toronto Civic Action Alliance, and then previously the CAO of Toronto Community Housing. So I think Chief Advocacy Officer, or something like that. Yeah. This is not meant to be a serious political insider analysis. This is really supposed to be like, look, I don't really know what's going on in the Toronto Mayoral elections. Here are the people I hear about all the time. I want to know what's going on and what they all have to offer, at least generally. And then you feel free to do your own research. Don't use this to decide who you're voting for. So let's take a look at the policies and see what each candidate is offering. The way that I've structured it is that we're going to look at each candidate slide by slide and analyze what each of their policies are based on the websites that they have given. So I haven't really extrapolated anything. A lot of this is directly copy pasted from what they have said directly or what they have decided to offer, the voters. So we've got Olivia Chow's City Homes Plan. So the goal here is 25,000 new rental homes for 50,000 people. Over 8 years, this would create, 7,500 affordable units and 2,500 income scaled units on city land. So the idea behind the income scale is, the more you make, the more you pay. The less you make, the less you pay. She wants to essentially create TO. You'll notice this about a lot of these candidates. They love adding the suffix TO or Toronto to a lot of their programs. To leverage, the federal government's, there's a federal government Canadian Home Program. So essentially, to be a developer and partner to build city-owned rental buildings. And here is when the problems, I think, start, at least a little bit. So 95% of the loan financing will come from the federal government, and this is where we see the problem of municipal politics, where a lot of the things that happen in municipal politics often happens or is a result of the generosity of either the province or the federal government. So, securing that loan financing from that program will be critical, and hopefully the federal government continues with that program. And this isn't something that would be cut off in a future election or something that would end, as policies change and shift. So this is ideally a self-sustaining model based on revenue generating from increasing the city build fund by 0.33%. So clearly, Olivia Chow's plan is to just build. Build over 8 years, and this is, you see what I mean. This is where the problems start to start. The question then becomes like, is this enough? Will this be enough homes? Will this be enough for the people? We're looking at a city that is growing consistently year over year, so we have yet to see. So that's going to be one of her plans. So take a look at that. So part of Chow's transit plan is actually building a dedicated busway along the current Scarborough Rapid Transit route. So the route here is outlined in blue. So we see that line 3 is closing in Q4 of 2023, so the fourth quarter. We can see that this route kind of follows from Kennedy Station, goes, relatively straight, and then goes towards Scarborough Town Center Station. So, this route isn't the most popular in the city. But it is important because it's, one of the few transit options for people who live here in this area. What is replacing this route is it's actually going to be the Scarborough subway that is slated for opening in 2030. So ideally in about 7 years if everything is on time. And as we know, famously, transit projects are always delivered on time. So the in-between stopgap measure would essentially be creating a dedicated busway along said current blue route. And the idea here is to really spend $60 million to reduce the transit time from 40 minutes if we were to use the regular lanes to 15 minutes if you were to use the busway. The only question that I would have regarding this is that I think this is an important stopgap measure and it's something that should happen, but is the $60 million worth reducing it from 40 minutes to 15 minutes? Or is a 25-minute route, which would be significantly cheaper, I imagine, that wasn't really costed, would that be more worth it? That would really be my only question. If Chow was able to present a plan that says, here is the costing of a 25-minute with bus lanes on regular streets, and bus lanes can then exist after the project is over, perhaps that would be a better use of money rather than a busway that would exist for, well, it would be for 7 years, it would actually be for a while. And then be replaced by a subway versus bus lanes that could survive onwards. But I think that's a really minor point. I know politically people are then going to say like, oh, you don't think that people of Scarborough are worth the extra, the 10 minutes that are going to be saved, but that's not really the point. The point is that like, can we just get a fully costing to see how much would it cost to reduce the 60 million to 25 million? If it's a marginal difference, then it's worth doing the 15 minutes. If it's a significant difference, for example, if it's $20 million instead of $60 million, perhaps that $40 million we can then spend on other projects in Scarborough, such as bike lanes and other bus lanes to speed up transit across the board. So the goal of this would essentially be using the money that is saved from rebuilding the eastern part of the Gardner as a ground level boulevard. According to Chow, rebuilding the eastern part of the Gardner. So the Gardner is the highway slash freeway that hugs the lakeshore, that goes into downtown. So it connects east west across Toronto, along the shore of Lake Ontario. And apparently that would save $500 million of essentially building it as a ground level, wide boulevard rather than a elevated highway that it is currently. So that would be that's her second policy right there. So affordable housing is really the big juicy ticket item for many candidates in this election. So what Olivia Chow wants to do is do $100 million annual investment to stop rent evictions by purchasing, repairing, and transferring said affordable rental apartments to organizations and nonprofits. So renovation is essentially the process. It's a portmanteau of renovation and eviction. So the way that it works is that landlords would kick out tenants because they would like to renovate that place in order to sell it in order to rent it for a higher price on the market. And essentially what happens is that removes that apartment from the pool of supply for people who are able to purchase it at that previous level before it was being renovated. So essentially, it makes housing a lot more expensive, and it really denies the opportunity for people who are currently living there to go back in unless they pay a significant amount more, which odds are they're not able to pay that significant amount more. So, $100 million to move 1,000 people each year by moving 667 units in rental buildings. So we're looking at a ratio of something like 2 people per rental apartment, something like that. Um, this would cost about $149,000 per person when we divide it. So in Toronto's market, I'm curious as to how far that's going to go, considering that condos and apartments are going for $500,000-$600,000 for purchase. So figuring out how the city is going to buy $149,000 per person worth of apartments in Toronto is going to be interesting. I imagine they'd do bulk buys, or they'd figure out some kind of method in that kind of sense. And I think this is where right of refusal comes into play. The problem here is that, it's not really a problem, but right of refusal is already in play in Montreal. And essentially what it is that it's the preemptive right for the city to acquire properties already listed for sale. So it doesn't mean that the city can eminent domain the properties. It doesn't mean the city seizes the properties. That's not what that means. What it means is that when somebody places their property up for sale, the city essentially has the first right to buy said property at the price that it's listed at. And essentially that prevents a lot of speculators, and that allows for Toronto to swoop in and start buying up properties without getting into like a bidding war. And the idea here is the greater good and all that. The fourth action item here is really doubling the reach of the Toronto Rent Bank. And the Toronto Rent Bank isn't really a bank in the traditional sense of issuing loans with interest or anything like that. It issues grants to people who are on the verge of homelessness, who are unable to pay rent for various circumstances. And these are programs that I think are critical to preventing homelessness. Homelessness doesn't occur in a vacuum. You're not just born homeless. What happens is oftentimes most Canadians are not far away from being homeless themselves. Most of us work paycheck to paycheck, and most of us probably don't have enough savings saved up to prevent said homelessness. So that's an important critical junction to prevent more homelessness from occurring. And homelessness is really this brutal spiral where when you're homeless, it's harder to get a job. It's harder to get a job. It's harder to make money. When it's harder to make money, it's harder to get into a home. So preventing that from happening in the first place is the best way to ensure that homelessness doesn't occur. So strengthening rent-safe TO and establishing the Toronto Renters Action Committee. So we see that Olivia Chow is really focusing more on the renters of the city, which make up about half the population, rather than half of the city that owns their own homes. So rent-safe TO is a program that not advises, but issues information to renters and potential tenants about their rights and information, and ensuring that that landlords are keeping up to standards and they're just not renting out slums to people who need housing. The Toronto Renters Action Committee is apparently going to be some form of city council organization, because the way that it's explained on the website is that this would allow, quote unquote, to have a voice at the table of city council. I don't think Chow means that there will literally be members from the Toronto Renters Action Committee voting in on city council meetings, but it seems to be more of like an advisory council kind of piece that is geared towards the renters of the city. So more information is never bad, but I think just more specifics regarding how that's going to work I think would be important. So the Science Center is is an interesting political football that's kind of emerged. So I'm going to use this kind of clicker here to describe where it is. So this is the Ontario Science Center here. This is the ravine that it backs onto. Here is Flemington Park, and here is Thorncliffe Park, just for just for context. So Olivia Chow's plan is to build homes and new schools on the Ontario Center parking lot. So there's a parking lot here, and there's a parking lot like here. So I'm not really sure where that's going to go without it, backing onto this garden and potentially destroying it, but that's interesting. The other thing is that there is already a school down here, which is a collegiate, and I imagine there's another school somewhere in this area as well, because that's typically how that works. But working with these two communities, which are often underserved and often marginalized, Flemington Park and Thorncliffe is home to a lot of immigrant communities. That serves these kids as just like a place and a park and a center of learning, I think is a positive. I'm just not sure about building homes and schools on this small section of land without it overcrowding the science center and without it already placing additional pressure on kind of the stuff that's going on here. It's also important to note that there is going to be a subway station or LRT line that's going to be somewhere here. You can see it being constructed over here. So there is going to be more public transit ability to be able to, there's going to be more public transit options for the people who will live here. So that's good. Overall, I think this is a perfectly fine idea. This is one of those projects where like I don't really think there's any negatives. And the positives seem to be fairly positive. It's just more concern of like how is this going to be done and when is it going to be done. This is more of a kind of like here's an idea that I have. Let me throw it out there and see what people think about it, rather than I think a really substantial, huge Toronto defining policy. But we are now on to Josh Matlow. So we've essentially wrapped up with the main points that Olivia Chow has to offer. So we can see that she's really focused more on housing as her main key points here. Josh Matlow has a lot of different programs and things. I think there were about 11 to 12 when I went through this. The very first one is the $115 million community fund that I think is extremely interesting. So essentially what this $150 million would do is, provide services to address risk factors that lead to criminal behavior. This would be funded through stabilizing the annual police budget at $1.16 billion for 3 years. So currently the police budget is at $1,160 million, $1.16 billion. And the idea here is to not increase the police budget and then use those planned increases to instead go into a community fund that would then address the root causes of criminal behavior, and then this would then fund community centers, spaces, activities, sports, all that kind of stuff. And this is a direct quote from Josh Matlow from his campaign website. He says, we cannot arrest our way out of violence. I don't think he's personally arresting anybody. We can make our community safer by investing in community level support. Overall, I think this is a solid idea in terms of actually investing in a community fund. We know that arresting more people is treating the symptoms but not the cause of the problem. If we get in early in underserved and marginalized communities, get children in like skills and sports and lots of these other programs, we've seen that this can lead to better outcomes in ensuring that students have healthy role models and they're not drawn towards violence or gangs. But we can see like all this criminal behavior, criminals aren't born. They're molded by their environments and things that happen to them over the course of their lifetime. So all of this stuff plays into access to sports, access to housing, access to good jobs, all these kind of things. People with decent jobs and solid housing aren't really incentivized to commit the crimes that we see on a daily basis. But people who are living in poor conditions, people who do not have access to good jobs, people who do not see opportunity beyond the blight of their community would turn towards gangs and other opportunities in order, in this idea of trying to make it out or this idea of trying to do better. So yeah, I think this is perfectly fine. And honestly, the Toronto police budget, personally, I think it is big enough. That's that. So this is one of my most favorite maps. So if you'll recall earlier from the Ontario Science Centre news, the reason why it's become such a big piece is that essentially Doug Ford, Premier of Ontario, wants to take Ontario Place. So this is Ontario Place here. It's right on the lakeshore off the coast of Toronto, and it's connected by these little bridge kind of things. What used to be a theme park, so this entire area used to kind of be this, this place used to be a theme park. There used to be, small roller coasters, that kind of thing. Um, it was essentially built to replicate Montreal's Expo 67, but ultimately it didn't really make enough money, and it shut down, and it's been abandoned for quite a while. Recently, what's happened is that this section has been built here. So Trillium Park's been made into like this beautiful, public parkland. This is more private kind of property. So we see Live Nation, Echo Recreo. They have like their own stages and events and activities. But this section here is was undetermined in terms of what's going to happen. Many have suggested turning it into another public park, and personally, I think it should be a public park that's being accepted. But what's happened instead is that Therm Group has allegedly taken up this property and have essentially been given the land by the Ontario government. I think it's been sold or whatever, the process is, and they're going to turn this into a private spa. So kind of like a day spa kind of thing. Personally, I think it's a bit silly building it there. I think this should just be a park that everyone can enjoy. But Matlow's plan is essentially withholding the city land from the spa. So the problem with Ontario Place is that a lot of it actually belongs to the province, because it was created by the province, and it's not technically a part of Toronto. It's literally just reclaimed land. It's not a natural island. It's artificial. So the province kind of has jurisdiction over giving the territory, or selling the territory to whoever or whatever wants to do things with it. So Doug Ford has decided to give it to this group. And also coincidentally, Mark Saunders is also on the board of advisors for the Ontario Place development thing. I don't know what a police officer knows about developing public spaces, but he's there. That's definitely. But maybe it's related to he was a PC candidate at Don Valley West, but that's speculative. I don't really have direct evidence of that, but you can we can figure that out later. So Matlow's plan here is to withhold 16 acres of city-owned property on Ontario Place that is needed by the government to proceed with plans for the site. So the idea is to revitalize the park fully integrated with a reimagined exhibition place. So exhibition place is around here. It's on the back here. So ideations connect. So according to the city staff, Therm needs 6 acres of city-owned land. So I imagine it's this land here, and 10 acres of city-owned water lots at Ontario Place in order to make their project viable. So his idea is essentially to hold this hostage in order to prevent it from being built, and then essentially go forward. There are 2 issues with this. There's a concern that since municipalities exist as a product of provincial governments, or they're a creature of provincial governments, they don't really exist in the constitution legally like provinces and the federal government does. It's possible that the province might just issue a law and seize that territory or find a way to grab it. The other issue is that Therm might just go ahead and building this and just exclude this territory and find a way to connect through this territory here, and that might be the stopgap. So I'm not sure if this would actually stop this from being built, if that's his goal. But I like the idea of this being a park, and that's essentially what he's proposing. So Matlow also wants to establish public build Toronto. So we see, the suffix Toronto makes a return on a lot of these public programs. What he wants to do is develop housing on city-owned land. And the idea here is that the city has 25 million square feet of just land that is available to be developed, according to Matlow. And it was to develop housing. So the idea here is to fund it with $300 million in seed funding from the city, and then waive all the municipal fees. So no property taxes, no development charges, nothing like that. So the idea here is that there would be 8,250 rent-controlled market apartments, and then 6,750 affordable apartments. And then the breakup and the makeup is 10% 3-bedroom, 20% 2-bedroom, and the rest would be 1-bedrooms. And the idea here is that $60 million would be generated, from rent and from fees annually for new construction. And the idea here is to be a bit more, is to create, consistently sustainable, affordable housing. And the money is to come from the ground level gardener rebuild. So we see, this gardener rebuild is a bit of a piggy bank for ideas. If we rebuild the Gardner as a ground level boulevard, then we have, estimated about $500 million to play with, and $300 million that would then go towards building, essentially over 20,000 or something different 15,000 to 20,000 forms of housing, and then every year $60 million worth of housing would be built. So we can then contrast this with Olivia Chow's plan of $100 million to get 667 units. So we can say that the $60 million plan, if we're using Chow's similar time frame, might add an additional 4 to 500 units every year on top of this 8,250. Toronto needs more housing. Toronto is also like the crane capital of North America. There was a report earlier that said, Toronto has 152 different cranes operating, which is more than the next 10 cities combined in North America. So buildings are being built and things are happening, but are these buildings built enough to handle the surge of population, or is enough being built to handle people who can't afford, the $4,000 a month condos and like those kind of elite kind of rentals? So I think overall this is an interesting idea. I think just more specifics on where this is going to be built, how it's going to be built, and exactly how it's going to be run, how it's going to be ran and managed and operated. I think it's going to be important. But overall, I think tackling the housing crisis is going to require big ideas like this. So this is the next part of it. So the tenant support, the idea of the creation of a quote fraud squad. So this would go after illegal rent evictions and landlord own use evictions. And increase funding to Mura. So $50 million to support purchasing of affordable apartment buildings under threat so they can be run by nonprofits. So similar to Olivia Chow's plan. Increase funding for paralegals to fight unfair above guidelines increases and advocate for the province for their removal, and enforce, the RTA, the Residential Tenancies Act, at the city level. So enforcing the RTA at the city level is interesting because I think currently the RTA is being enforced only at the provincial level. So this way, landlords then also have to contest with the city whenever they get, whenever they get complaints. And then criminalizing landlord fraud to the point of police investigations, I think is interesting, is essentially prevent landlords from, getting away from a lot of these finesses that they may be operating. So this is essentially just a lot more bureaucracy and a lot more buildings in order to ensure that tenants are supported the way they need to be supported, and then increase funding for Toronto Tenant Support Program to support outreach. A lot of these programs I like to call are kind of like invisible programs. You don't really notice them until you need them. The other programs are big things you're going to notice. You're going to notice the construction of the Scarborough subway. You're going to notice, the big Ontario Place stuff. You're going to notice the Toronto housing that's going to be going up, all that kind of stuff. But all these squads and initiatives and bureaucracies are not things you're going to notice, but I think they're important to have. And once again, the issue here, I think, is just being a bit more specific into how is this exactly going to work, which nonprofits, which co-op operators, how is this going to be enforced at the city level? What if the province overrules it? What happens then? Forming a building permits team is, how many people are going to have, how how do we expect to enforce that, and how many teams are we going to dedicate to? Are we going to go top of the list? Are we going to have people complain, and the more complaints a landlord has, those go to the top of the list? Or essentially just a bit more specific on how that's going to work. It's hard to be opposed to this. I don't see anything necessarily wrong with it. I think it just needs more specifics. So currently in Toronto, there is the Dine Safe program. So it kind of rates, how gross a restaurant is based on these kind of color passes. So green is ideal. It means, congrats, you passed the test. Yellow is a conditional pass, meaning that, you can pass as long as you fix these kind of minor things. And a close is a red, which means, this place is gross and we've shut it down for, health reasons, which is concerning because I don't think I've ever seen a red. I've seen a couple of yellows. I've seen mostly green. But red is really sus. I've never seen those. But they exist. They're definitely out there. You can find on the subreddit r/Toronto. There used to be a thread of closed restaurants for the week, which was fun to look at. So The idea of rent-safe TO, according to Matlow, not to be confused with Olivia Chow's rent-safe, is to implement color-coded signs similar to the program and put them outside of said rental apartment buildings so that tenants are aware of the quality of the rental and so they can make an informed decision whether they want to rent or continue living or whatever. So he would also introduce a maximum temperature bylaw of 26 degrees Celsius in apartment units and then allow windows in high rises to open more than 10 centimeters. So currently the bylaw is that, in apartment units and in high rises above a certain floor, you cannot open the window more than 10 centimeters. The other issue is in a lot of these apartments, you can't really control the heating yourself. Sometimes it's controlled by the landlord. So then we see that sometimes landlords blast the heating to be way too high, and it's hard to open a window to get that fresh air to kind of alleviate those temperatures and that kind of thing. Overall, makes sense. The only issue is that safety, but I'm sure there's engineers and stuff who can figure that out. That's not really my job. There will be a mandate for landlords to then install, oh my god, I misspelled. Ignore the misspelling. To install heavy-duty screens to provide protection from falls, but really allow for windows to be fully opened. I'm not sure what screens are strong enough to prevent a child from falling if they were to push up against it. I may be ignorant on this, apart from just like metal bars, but I'm not sure if they're, metal bars is the aesthetic we're going for here. So he wants windows to be fully open, but also screens that won't, collapse if a child were to, lean against it, or a child were to push up against it, or someone to like, slam into it or whatever. I don't know about, the viability of that, but the idea makes sense. Windows should be able to be open more than 10 centimeters. Maybe 30. I don't know. If there are engineers anywhere, you can take a look at that. Increase the allowable fines on landlords. I think, just more penalties for, doing sus behavior. Hire contractors to fix, that's a Z, ignore, to fix boilers or really pest infestation. So really the idea here is that, after a certain amount of time, the city is just going to send in people to fix the issues and then you'll get billed. You would get billed for it. So implementing standards for how much time can pass before landlords comply with work orders, I think, is an incredible and important part or piece to do. A lot of times, a lot of landlords don't really have enforcement action taken against them, and a lot of people just suffer with pest infestations or just issues that can and should be solved, but they don't really have a lot of recourse in forcing the landlord to do the thing. So getting the city to just run in and do it, and then billing the landlord, I think might be a good incentive. Increasing the funding again to the Toronto Tenant Support Program to inform tenants of their rights. A lot of these issues stem from the fact that a lot of people are not informed about their rights. I've had a personal experience when I was living in Quebec, where landlords would try to extort you for a $1,000 furniture deposit. But in Quebec specifically, furniture deposits are illegal, and as soon as you inform them of that, they suddenly stop responding to you, or they don't talk to you, or they ignore that fact, and they just move on and they just let you rent the place. But there are many people who don't know that rule or are uninformed about that rule and willingly pay the $1,000 furniture deposit, and that's just one example. And I imagine Toronto and Ontario has a lot of similarities. Now that I've moved back to Toronto, I'm slowly rereading up on these rental rights and tenant rights. So really, more information is never bad. More information only hurts the dishonest and the poor landlords that really shouldn't be in business to begin with. Open Schools Toronto, I'm a fan of this. The idea of using schools to work as community centers on evenings and weekends. This would be funded through the Community Health and Safety Fund, and the idea is to open up 25 schools in underserviced neighborhoods. So it'd be 4 classrooms, library, or music rooms. That's what he said. Double gym from 6 to 10 p.m. on weekdays, 8 to 6 on Saturdays, 8 to 3 on Sundays and holidays. So these are fairly long hours. I think as an idea, it makes sense. A lot of these schools are already strategically placed next to housing, so it'll be close for students to get there. Students and young people are relatively familiar with their schools if they go to class. So I think this makes sense of using these schools as a double-use facility. If the schools are just kind of sitting empty on a weekend, and especially after school, why not make full use of the schools and integrate them as fully part of the community rather than building new infrastructure? The other positive is that there is a report that the TDSB is relatively land rich but cash poor. So I think this would be a healthy injection into the TDSB, and I think this would be a good symbiosis between the city, the TDSB, Toronto District School Board, and the students in the community to use said centers more often, to have just like a good space to hang out and, not be in the streets. Out of all the things that Toronto does poorly, I think the Toronto Public Library is one of the best things that they do. The Toronto Public Library is probably the gem in the public services. It is fantastic and excellent, and this is reflected in the fact that the vast majority of Torontonians use the library system. There's over 100 branches in the city, and I think, there was a statistic, and you can kind of read up on this, but it's like the most used library system, like that's the most used public library system in the world. So clearly it's popular and beloved. So I think, spending more money to support it and it being a community space is an excellent thing. There's really nothing negative about this. I think this is a great idea. And here's when we get into really interesting stuff. So regarding the climate, what Matlow wants to do is essentially spend $200 million in new money to accelerate the progress towards net zero GHG emissions. So the idea of this is to spend this $200 million on these programs, which is to help, residential commercial construction run off electric energy by 2028. I don't really know what this means. Um, Electric energy as in like the trucks and the cranes and the dump trucks are going to be fully electric, or does it mean like the drills themselves are electric and not using diesel generators? But I think currently a lot of those are electric to begin with. I'm not really sure what this means, so I think there needs to be more clarification. The other side of it is that the majority of Ontario's power already comes from renewable resources. So, nuclear and hydro make up a significant chunk of what we already use to generate power. So I'm not really sure by how constructional runoff of electric energy. I think that needs to be clarified. I don't really know what he means by that. I don't think the average voter knows either. The other thing is retrofitting the existing buildings in Toronto, so switching from fossil to electric. Again, I don't really understand what this means. So does this mean like the heating will go away from natural gas to electric heating? Or using solar panels to heat and to create electricity in the buildings. The only problem with this is the reason why we don't heat with electricity, unlike in Quebec, is because electricity in Ontario is more expensive than in Quebec, so it makes more sense to use natural gas. So again, I'm not really sure what he means by, because there's not like diesel generators in the buildings that are running stuff, or maybe I think he needs to be more clear about what he means by this. Lower fares, more pedestrian-friendly communities. This makes a ton of sense. Pedestrian-friendly communities, walkable communities, places where you can, walk around in and be in and don't necessarily need a car, has been shown to be healthier for you, better for you, less obesity, and better for the planet. And honestly, it's just you just feel better being able to walk to your neighbor, and walk to your store, and, hang out rather than being stuck in god-awful traffic all the time. So I think that's a fine idea. Electrifying the city's vehicle fleet and TTC buses. So I think this is a fairly good concept to do, and this is really within the purview of Toronto, so this makes sense. There's already a bunch of electric buses that are out there that are being tested and run around. So I think that's a perfectly fine idea. The interesting thing here is that taxis and ride-sharing vehicles to be electric by 2030 is interesting because ride-sharing vehicles, so like Uber and Lyft, are often people's personal vehicles that they then use on the app. So I'm not sure how that's actually going to be enforced in terms of how do you guarantee that someone who's signing up to the Uber app is actually a electric vehicle. Then I guess you'd have to introduce some sort of licensing standard to ensure that, or force Uber to ensure that the vehicles that their drivers use are electric. Um, I'm not really entirely sure how that. I think it's probably eventually going to happen just by by time, and essentially considering that the government of Canada wants to stop ICE vehicles, so internal combustion engines, being sold by 2030. So it's a matter of time that this will probably happen. But I'm not sure in terms of how this is going to be enforced, and in terms of how that's going to create that kind of impact. Transport is really interesting. So for the TTC, what he wants to do is increase funding to restore pre-pandemic service levels, invest $50 million from the City Works Fund, and then a parking lot levy would be used to fund the remaining amount of the $183 million needed to restore full service. So parking lot levy would essentially be a tax on parking lots in the downtown region. and essentially, charging people for parking their cars downtown and really incentivizing them to use public transit instead. And to incentivize further public transit use would increase the quality of the TTC by increasing said funding. So road design is extremely important. So you'd be spending $33 million to fix the city's most dangerous intersections and roads. So imagine the way that they would fix is essentially introducing bollards and lanes and a lot more pedestrian and traffic protections. Apparently 98 of 100 of the city's most dangerous roads are in Scarborough and North York, so go us. We thought we did something right there. That's incredible. But here's an example. So this is Midland and Shepherd. So this is Midland, this is Shepherd. And we see that the crux of the issue is that these lanes are gigantic. It takes a huge amount of time to cross, and since these lanes are so wide, people are incentivized, wide and straight, they're extremely incentivized to go beyond the speed limit, because since the lanes are so wide, your perception of speed is a lot lower than you think it is, and also you just think you can because the lanes are so wide, you have a ton of space. The way to combat this is actually making the lanes smaller, so people are a lot more cautious, introducing better bike lanes, and just introducing better pedestrian and traffic protection. So I think that's essentially how that's going to be solved. But this is just a fundamental issue in designing roads that are just far too big with a speed limit of 50 kilometers, 60 kilometers, when really they should be having much lower speed limits, or the road should be smaller in order for them to be safer. The green belt. So this is really important. So the green belt is essentially a section of area that's designed to prevent housing and development in this zone as much as possible. So the idea here is to essentially protect these watersheds, these forests, and essentially protect the quality and supply of nature that is happening around Toronto, a major city. So what Matlow would do is essentially rally municipal leaders that live within this region and redirect legal staff from compliance work towards environmental protection work, and you'd intervene at the Ontario Land Tribunal where Toronto's interests are threatened. The idea here is to involve the federal government to stop the provincial government of opening up the green belt to land development. And then this would work in combination with green gravel and procurement policy to boycott purchasing new sand and gravel from the green belt, which I imagine would have an impact on some of the economies of these areas. But honestly, this stuff is pretty critical to protect and save. So I think this is important. This is good. So the Scarborough Moves plan is large. It's a $1.2 billion commitment, and the idea here is to introduce a network of public transit routes, cycling, and walking trails that should shorten commute times and improve quality of life. Every bike lane that's built, that's just hundreds of cars off the street, and that's super effective, and that's critical to have. Part 2 and Part 3 and Part 4, you can see this on the map. We've got the Eglinton East LRT, so we've got this one going all the way down Kingston, which again, I think is a fantastic idea and I think should be built. 23 stops, that's just going to facilitate better connectivity and better, essentially building, better all across the board. The Shepherd East LRT, so that's over here, would be 9 stops from McCowan to Nielsen Road, and the idea here is to... Is that it? Yeah. So that's essentially what that would do, and then the rapid busway would be here, to access a stopgap. I think this is just fantastic. More transit in this area of Scarborough is important for improving housing viability. The further that people can live away from the downtown core, and the easier it is to get to said downtown core or areas in this, makes these houses much more available to people who would like to leave downtown core or other areas, and it just makes things, just better across the board. So now we've got Mark Saunders, whose whole, guise is community safety. Well, not guise, his whole idea is community safety. And what he said is that he's going to meet with the Prime Minister and call for urgent reform to the bail system and criminal code. The idea of the creation to push for a reverse onus at bail hearings for violent repeat offenders. So the idea here is to actually just change the way that the justice system works. So the people who fall into these groups should have an onus being held until they are present until they present, a good reason to be released, which honestly I think is quite dangerous to create this precedent. The idea of like, you should prove your innocence or you should prove why you deserve freedom prior to be given it, which goes against our current system, which is the prosecutor, the crown has to prove why we should continue holding you when the default is that you should be free. So creating a reverse onus is an interesting task for the mayor of Toronto. Attempting to change the criminal code and then the justice system at the federal level, and ensure the bail hearings for the most serious firearm offense ever heard by a judge of superior court, then at the lower provincial court level. What this feels like is a police officer grieving his, or like airing his grievances and frustrations with the system, but without really any legal background or any jurisdiction over the federal code. So I think this as a community safety policy, the idea of a mayor of Toronto focusing on the criminal justice system at the federal level, I think is kind of inappropriate and not really doesn't really make any sense. I would focus on other things. I would not. I don't think this is a good idea at all. And I think this will just get bogged down in legal arguments when, if he does somehow succeed, he's just going to be sued left and right by a bunch of legal aid and legal rights clinics, because this is a terrible idea personally. But anyways, moving on. So the TTC safety plan, I think, is one of his better ideas. It's the idea of increasing the number of special constables, these guys from to 200, and get them into stations, so visible and riding subways, on platforms, and on stations. Creating new assist buttons for subways and buses. Prevent loitering on TTC property. And make streetcars and bus stops safer by creating a minimum lighting standard and installing a more high quality camera feed in all subways. Again, I don't know. It's not a bad idea, but I'm not sure if this is within the purview of the mayor of Toronto. I think this should be something that should be done on a lower city council meeting, and this should be something that's done with the TTC and the police chief working together, rather than the mayor of Toronto personally overriding with this. The idea of working with local school boards to ensure students are educated about transit safety and security practices, such as traveling in groups. Sure, there's like nothing negative about it, but really, is this what the mayor of Toronto should be focusing on? Rather than bigger scale projects such as the actual infrastructure, and try and leave the safety up to the police, who have a over $1 billion budget to handle said matters. I don't know. I was curious as to the supervised injection site idea, what he had to offer Saunders. So he would immediately turn the city's focus on street cleanliness and movability in residential areas around supervised injection sites, and redirect any underutilized cleaning resources to these areas in a surge capacity. So that's fine. I think those areas should be cleaned, and that's perfectly okay. There's really nothing wrong with that. Zero tolerance policy towards needle disposal outside of supervised injection sites. I don't think anyone disagrees with this on principle, that supervised injection sites should be clean and we shouldn't be disposing needles. The problem is, what does zero tolerance mean? Who gets fined if there are needles? Who gets punished? How is that even going to work? And what does that mean, zero tolerance policy? It's already illegal. You really shouldn't be disposing needles outside. It's not like you can do that already, but the issue is that there's how do you enforce one person dropping a needle? That's the only problem. A color-coded syringe system to enable the tracking of the needle sources, to enable decision-making that focus on areas and source of discarded needles. I don't really know what this means, so I imagine, is this the idea to then track down the health unit that distributed said said needles, and then punish them for doing it? Because it's definitely not the health units that are dropping needles, it's the users afterwards or whatever is happening. So I'm not really sure how that's going to be enforced. How do you enforce that somebody then I guess you just ensure that needles aren't taken outside of the center. I'm not familiar enough with supervised injection sites to understand how they work, but from what I understand, they don't work by you just get an unlimited supply and you go outside and you can shoot up outside of said clinics. I don't know if this is actually going to solve anything. A highly visible option within 311 to report used needles. Sure, like that's fine. Like there's really nothing wrong with that. I think it should be dealt with. I just don't know if this is going to be the way to solve it directly, and if this is really the purview of the mayor. The overdose strategy. So you'd revisit the overdose action plan to focus more on treatment as a key priority for the cities, as opposed to, quote, continuing to expand the facilitation of drug use. So clearly, to some degree, he doesn't view supervised injection sites as a treatment option, as a solution, and that the only option for treatment is for someone to be completely sober and clean, which I think kind of ignores, the issue of a lot of these drug addictions. And I don't think that supervised injection sites facilitate drug use, rather they prevent overdose deaths from people taking, sus drugs, and essentially they're in a safe facility where they can then access other resources to get on the path to rehabilitation. So the point of this isn't to give people drugs. The point of this is so people have a center where they can come to, rather than a dealer or off the street, so they can actually interact with a nurse, get treated, and kind of get on a better path. Yeah, so essentially this is what he says: to lead drug users to treatment as opposed to continuing a cycle of addiction. It's idealist, that is the end goal. But this assumes that injection sites don't already do this, or are failing in doing this, and somehow Saunders, as the chief of police, is going to implement something in order to do that. I don't really know how that's going to work. He'd also work closely with the province to identify and explore the creation of additional inpatient treatment option resources. Yeah, I think that's fine. That makes sense. Health is a provincial responsibility, so him working closely with the province, I think that's appropriate, and that makes sense. Working with the feds and the provincial government to right size the available treatment beds and resources. So again, like, these are more policies that are contingent on the federal government and the provincial government working with the city. These are not things that the city can do on its own, which I think is going to be the problem with a lot of Saunders' ideas, is that they hinge a lot on the federal government and the provincial government willing to work with him and seeing things his way. Which may ultimately lead to 4 years of not very much happening for Toronto. So I don't know. I am not a fan of Saunders' transit plans. They read a lot like a boomer's understanding of traffic and transit and cars, and essentially this reads like somebody who doesn't really use other forms of transit other than the car to get through the city. Um, you know, certain people would call this car brain, or whatever. But his main points are opening up King Street to all traffic. Currently, King Street is a streetcar only kind of express lane. I don't really see how that's going to alleviate anything. A lot of these ideas just scream frustrated driver wants to be mayor in order to solve some of his commute being a bit longer than usual, which I don't think is really appropriate for the mayor of Toronto. That's what I feel, and that's what it seems like is occurring. He said that he would reevaluate the bike lanes in Richmond and Adelaide based on actual usage and net impact of congestion. He seems to be really anti-bike lane, which personally doesn't really make any sense, because cars take up far, far more space than bikes and bike lanes do. A car lane takes up much more space than a bike lane does. Bikes are extremely efficient ways of getting through downtown. We can see examples of this in Montreal, where, you know, even if one person gets out of a car and gets onto a bike because it's quicker and cheaper and more efficient, that reduces pollution, reduces space taken up, and that creates less traffic. Traffic is you are traffic. You driving down the road contributes to traffic. So if you can reduce the amount of people getting into cars because it's more convenient to take a bike, then that makes sense in reducing traffic and reducing congestion. So I don't really understand how the bike lanes are contributing to congestion, and somehow an extra lane would improve said congestion. That doesn't really make any sense. And studies have shown, and urban planners have shown, that opening up more lanes doesn't really lead to better times. What it does lead to is just more cars being incentivized to use the road, and now we're back to the problem of traffic again. Limiting the number of road closures in the city at one time, like, okay. Expedite construction lane closure on Richmond and Adelaide. Again, like, this just seems like a personal frustration regarding that area. Construction needs to happen. It's a growing city. Like, you just have to plan around it. Removing the bike lanes on University Avenue, I think this one makes the least amount of sense. So in this image, we have a view of University Avenue. You can see you've got 1, 2, and then a third turning lane. This lane here is a parking lane, which is actually, if you would remove this and turn it into a car lane, that would actually add more cars. But no, we want to remove the bike lane, which is the half of this, to the right over here, and somehow that's going to facilitate better traffic when all of these bikes take up far less space than all of these cars that are currently just stuck here. And the only reason these cars are here is because these people didn't take the bikes down the bike lane. I don't really see how that's going to improve traffic or congestion at all. If anything, there should be more bike lanes. This entire place probably just should be a bike lane, and this parking should be removed, so then people can be incentivized to take a bike or take the subway down. It doesn't really make any sense. And then reverse the decision to make Yonge Street bike lanes permanent, pending a review of the data and consultation process. I don't even know what this means. Like, what data is there to review that? Bikes, we can see this study after study, bikes contribute to lowering congestion because you're more incentivized to get out of a car, which takes up more space. It's healthier, it's happier. Again, like, I don't really understand what the review of the data is going to show. The data will show that yes, bike lanes reduced traffic times, reduced congestion, and like it made a couple of drivers vaguely more like inconvenient to drive them, but really I don't really see how that's gonna improve. Deprioritize the Bloor Street West bike lane expansion. Silly idea. I think this is out of touch and largely ignorant of the needs of the city. And in reality, we should be having more bike lanes. It improves traffic, it improves congestion, it reduces pollution, it makes things a lot better. It improves businesses and things like that. We can even see most people driving by are not going to randomly park and stop into a business. It's often people who are on foot or on bikes who will stop into a business and check it out. Immediately suspend all bike lane expansion pending a renewed approach to accountability and community consultation for both residents and BIAs. I don't really support this at all. I don't really see why these consultations need to exist. We see the study after study, statistic after statistic, bike lanes improve community outcomes. I don't really see why residents along a few streets, NIMBYs along a few streets should have a say in the overall traffic impact on the entire city. If they personally don't ride bikes, but somehow they drive more cars, I don't really know why they should have a say in, not having bike lanes for the thousands of people who do ride bikes and who will reduce impact. Again, I think there should be data driven rather than how people feel about an issue. If they feel they don't like bike lanes, that shouldn't really matter. It should be the statistics, and the data shows that bike lanes matter and they're good and they're important. Establishing accessibility and disability rights to group with disabilities so they can get around their city. This, I think, is being used as the idea that somehow bike lanes prevent people with disabilities from getting around the city, and somehow bike lanes deprioritize people with disabilities. I think it's a bit silly because many people with disabilities can't drive cars either. Many people with disabilities can't walk either, but we don't deprioritize roads, we don't deprioritize sidewalks. Bike lanes not really taking away from really anyone in that sense. I don't really see how a bike lane is more dangerous. A bike going at 20 kilometers an hour, how is that more dangerous than cars speeding down at 60 kilometers an hour who could potentially hit someone in a wheelchair? And better bike lanes, better sidewalks, improve accessibility for people who are blind and in wheelchairs and that kind of thing. So I don't really understand how that's that kind of stuff. The impact of bike lanes on snow clearing around residential and business areas. I mean, look, Montreal's already solved this. Montreal has snow plows that clean up bike lanes. They have different adjustable tools and measurements in order to do that. This is not some impossible idea to solve. If we're able to create an entire lane blocked off just to park cars on one of the busiest streets in the country, I don't see why a 2-meter bike lane that reduces traffic and reduces this problem is somehow creating issues of snow clearing, when really the problem is sidewalks being cleared and bike lanes being cleared would improve traffic rather than these roads being cleared. So I think Saunders' transit ideas are very much out of touch and uninformed, and they read like somebody who has personal grievances with traffic in the city and wants to solve them to make sure that he can get around the city easier in his car rather than looking at the data and the impact of that. So personally, I don't think this is a very good idea. That's going to be my opinion on that. God. The housing idea. So cut the time for approval applications to 1 year. No idea how that's going to happen. Not sure he's going to guarantee that. Make builders in the city accountable to each other by introducing a mesh system of performance measures. I don't know what that means. So does this mean if the city fails a performance measure, is the builder now able to sue the city? Will the city sue developers if they don't, associate that way? Designate one city staff member to navigate an application through the city's process. Okay, like I don't really understand why the city process has to be so complicated that we have to designate one person to navigate a single application through the city's process. So does this mean one city member per application? One city staff member handles many applications? Why do we even need a city staff member to navigate applications? Why can't they just apply on the website? You know what I mean? Like, all this stuff is just a bit silly. Remove silos between departments and city hall. Ensure they all cooperate to the same standards and timelines. I mean, different departments handle different things. I don't know how realistic it is to expect that every single department act on the exact same timeline every time. Environmental impact study takes as long as it does, versus, perhaps a bike lane study versus perhaps, cleaning up the calls from 301 for a dead raccoon. I don't know why they would all be on the exact same timeline. I don't know if this can actually improve any efficiency beyond just a line on a campaign. Digitize processes, that's cool. I think that makes sense. It's perfectly fine. Work with local union to encourage more people to join the skilled trades, fine. That's perfectly fine. Call on the federal government to ensure our immigration system supporting the skilled labor needed now. Again, like, I don't really see how this is a city issue, and I don't really see how the mayor is going to then try and impact federal policy. So again, is this idea contingent on the federal government agreeing with Mark and doing this? If so, then I don't really see how that's going to be successful. I don't know. My point is, like, being the mayor, you should try and campaign on policies that you think you can realistically achieve within your powers with, perhaps a little bit of negotiation. But if a lot of your ideas are contingent on the federal government agreeing with you, I think that opens up a possibility where the federal government doesn't go through with you. You are then able to say, like, you see, it's not my fault. The federal government doesn't want to do it. And then you can just kind of coast for a couple of years. I don't really like this at all. So, permitting 1 to more floors per rental or condo building or up to 20 additional units where appropriate. I'm not really sure what that means, so I guess he wants to make buildings taller. Okay, fine. Change the requirements of the housing now to TO housing now, or the Toronto housing now, to make it easier for developers to get financing for affordable housing. I'm not sure how those requirements are going to change. Wasn't very specific in the campaign, but I think just more specifics about this are important, and this is worrying. We don't really want, why should a developer get public money to build affordable housing that they would then profit from? I don't know about that. I think we should get more insight on that. So the Saunders housing stuff gets even more interesting. So we get this take the property tax off affordable housing units in future development. Apparently this will have no impact on city financing, despite taking the property tax off. Okay. Press the federal government to waive the HST on all new large-scale purpose-built rental housing projects. Again, like, this is contingent on the federal government agreeing with Mark to waive the HST. I don't know, like, how successful that's going to be as the mayor of Toronto. Explore the possibility of tax and other, ignore racks, that's supposed to be tax. Tax and other incentives. So again, more free money to developers. I think that's the plan. I don't know. Don't quote me on that. I'm just reading this as how I interpret it. If I'm interpreting it wrong, then write it in the comments. Or Mark Saunders, you can send me an email or write something in the comments, and I'll be happy to fix and adjust it. I'm, not partisan. I don't really like one candidate over the other very much, but like, some of these ideas I think need to be reviewed or adjusted or explained better. Review the Toronto Development Charge now, a framework to ensure that monies collected are benign, directed toward their intended purpose, or being direct, not benign. What the hell? Being directed toward their intended purpose. Okay, so just like an audit. Explore a federal last mile program to top up funding for projects. So now he wants to go and create federal policies as the mayor of Toronto, and from what I've understood is that essentially, for developers that are unable to secure the totality of housing from banks, the federal government would then just toss in some money for the loan. Again, like, trying to create federal policy at the municipal level, I think, is ambitious. Don't know how successful that will be, and not sure how willing the federal government will be to explore municipal ideas like that. Changing the definition of infrastructure used by the Canadian Infrastructure Bank to include housing is bold. Again, this is more federal stuff, so more federal policy, more advocating to the feds, not a lot of Toronto-based things that within the powers of mayor that he can directly do. Work with the provincial government, again, more provincial and more non-municipal stuff to make it easier for nonprofits to secure loans from Infrastructure Ontario for new rental housing projects. So what the actual Toronto housing stuff boils down to is taking property taxes off affordable housing units and letting them build bigger. I don't see any progress in terms of actually building these. I don't see any money put towards building units. I don't see any money that is helping to, pay certain rents or availability opportunities. A lot of these seem contingent on the fact that a federal government and the provincial government will in concert agree with Mark Saunders and then somehow give money to build these things. So then the question remains, what is the mayor doing and what is the municipal government then doing? So, pursue the Toronto community housing model where the city land is provided to builders, again, free land for builders, in return for including affordable and supporting housing, and the city gets a share of the profits from market unit sales. Why would the city not just build them and sell them directly? Why do we have to involve developers and giving the land to the developers? If the developers now own the land, that's worth a lot more than somehow getting a share of the profits. I'm not sure why that would be necessary. We've seen Olivia Chow, we've seen Matlow, we've seen Bailao, we've seen a lot of these other ideas where they don't depend on giving away free land like that. Speaking of Bailao, Bailao's plan. So highways and housing. So the provincial highways idea is essentially uploading the Gardner and the DVP back to provincial responsibility, which I think makes a lot of sense. In her campaign, she noted that the other provincial highways, the 401, the 407 that goes through these municipalities, the cities don't have to pay for them, yet the Gardner and the DVP that many people outside of Toronto use to get into Toronto is solely paid by Toronto, yet many people outside of Toronto use it. So there's a bit of unfairness there. So I think making a provincial highway makes a lot of sense in terms of saving the costs for the city when really it shouldn't be a city responsibility. If it benefits everyone else in the GTA, it should be a collective responsibility then. So the housing plan would be expanding the Dufferin Grove pilot project citywide and creating pathways out of homelessness, specialized anti-displacement and evictions prevention unit with 30 staff, freezing new proposals that would demolish rental apartment buildings. So you already see there's a lot more meat to Bailao's plan compared to Saunders, and there are very specific plans regarding, what are we going to do exactly. So Bailao's building homes would be ensuring that 20% of new homes built by 2031 would be purpose-built rental homes. We would speed up the construction for nonprofit and cooperative housing, double the amount of modular supportive homes to create long-term pathways out of homelessness. A 10-year target of 1,000 homes is fairly small, but again, we got to start somewhere. $5 million to expand the Dufferin Grove, the Sufferin Dufferin as it is known, to support persons living outside. This is just various money to shelters and charities to ensure that people don't end up homeless when they're escaping violence or domestic abuse and things like that. Holding the feds responsible for financially supporting refugees and newcomers in Toronto, that is interesting. Again, like I said about Saunders, I don't know how successful that's going to be, and it also just depends on the federal government, and also depends how willing the federal government is to support Toronto and to support that current mayor. So I'm not sure how successful that is going to be, but the other stuff seems to be within the purview of the city. So for the Housing Now projects, the idea is that there would be a building permit issued by a certain date, and they have to actually start the construction within 6 months. If these conditions are not met, the city would actually cancel the funding and re-tender the site. So the idea here is to actually force builders to build them quickly, or they just lose the money. So you actually invest $10 million to speed up construction readiness, and then we would leverage the funding from the Canadian government, from the Canadian Mortgage Housing Corporation, something like that, which is the federal institution that would help in building a lot of these stuff. Surplus municipal properties for nonprofit and cooperative housing, so essentially using the city land to build affordable homes. Foster safe, healthy, vibrant through support for skilled trades. Again, similar to Saunders, focusing on the skilled trades, apprenticeship, ensuring that students or people shouldn't need to go to university in order to succeed. They need to be able to be in their own skills, and that's perfectly fine. Push the provincial government to give Toronto authority to approve development on sites zoned for rental housing. This is challenging. I'm not sure how willing the provincial government is going to be willing to give that powers to the city. So again, I'm a bit worried about this this section here. Again, this also depends on provincial government. Like I said about Saunders, anything that's outside of the purview of directly what the mayor can do is kind of a mixed bag because it just depends on what the government in power that are appeasing to determines is okay. So City Hall, semi-annual public updates on progress, building with a focus on the missing middle in housing, and really leading a mayor's initiative on residential intensification to develop incentives and launch new policies to support the delivery of 285,000 new homes by 2031. So essentially, this is just reports, ensure that the regulations support a missing middle, so things that are medium scale and medium density. That's not just high rises and small single family homes. So I think that's fine. That just makes sense. Yeah, so the safety stuff is also interesting. So we would actually redeploy and hire TTC staff to have more eyes and ears at stations and platforms across the city, increase security camera coverage, expand Toronto Community Crisis Service to cover the entire city, enhance open data collection for better policies. I don't know about that. Introduce mobile mental health clinics, and then support amending subsection 269 of the criminal code. So again, like criminal code, that's going to be an interesting thing to do. I don't know if that's going to be within the jurisdiction of the mayor of Toronto to handle, but yeah, again, that's going to be interesting. So reverse all the cuts and improve cleaning schedule. So these are all things that are gonna just take a little bit of time. But yeah, we'll see how that works. But again, some of the stuff is within the purview, some of the stuff isn't. So this just remains to be seen. Support for seniors. This section had a huge paragraph, but really what it is spending $23 million to create mobile health clinics and to refer individuals to health services and create food hampers for those who are in need. And the idea here is to take pressure off the healthcare system because the majority of healthcare money is actually spent on seniors because they're at the point of their lives where they need the most amount of medical attention. So using these mobile clinics would essentially hopefully identify issues before they get super worse and then put more pressure on the system. And this way, we can kind of deal with that early. I think that makes sense. I think that's fine. And it's relatively cheap. And again, with the Ontario Science Centre, with the building 5,000 new homes and 1,500 affordable homes, where the lots and the lands outside the ravine are currently located, I'm not really sure where this is going to be built. Again, like sure, I don't know. I think there's just to be better planning and better maps in terms of like where that exactly is going to look like, what that's going to be built, and then we can have better information on whether this is a good or bad idea. But for now, on the surface, I'm not sure how this is going to work. So the Safe TTC by Bradford. So his idea is to essentially install platform edge doors at subway stations. So the way that works is kind of noted here. So before a subway train shows up, these glass doors are closed. When the subway train shows up, the doors line up with the doors of the train. The doors open, you get in. No one can jump on the tracks in between. Cool. Boost security and safety patrols and cell reception to subways across the network. Shocking, we still don't have this. One of the largest cities in North America, we still don't have this. Again, fine. I think this is going to be perfectly okay. I think all this stuff makes sense, and it's just going to work. There's really nothing to be super against. So in terms of traffic, congestion relief commissioner to end the traffic chaos, so really an abstract goal. I don't really know how that's going to end, and coordinate all construction maintenance work across Toronto. So does this mean all the construction happens at the same time? Does this mean that we structure construction to happen and stagger at certain times to reduce the impact? But considering that we have the most amount of cranes in North America and the most amount of construction sites happening at any one time, how successful is that going to be, and what does success look like? Is that is a 1% reduction in congestion, a 1% reduction in traffic? Is that a success that's worth the multi-million dollars worth in coordinating it, or what is the end goal? 200 parking enforcement officers to unclog intersection. I think that's good. We have a serious enforcement problem in Toronto where a lot of drivers will just park in bike lanes or block traffic or cross intersections knowing that they won't be able to clear it, therefore creating gridlock and congestion. As we kind of see here, someone is blocking the lane. Deploying these parking enforcement officers to ticket and fine them, and so people know that they'll be enforced, I think is a good way of doing it. And free money for the city. That's just that's cool. That's fine. Like there's nothing here that's super major, huge. This is an idea. This is more of what should be doing. There's nothing super brand new. So on the left here, I have a picture of the missing middle that many talk about. That is currently, this is in Montreal. This is in the Plateau neighborhood. And you can see each one of these is a different apartment. So you see that's like one apartment, two apartment, three apartments. So 4 to 6 unit kind of buildings. This is kind of the missing middle that we're talking about. Where instead of single family homes that house one family or huge 30-floor high rises, these kind of 3 to 6 floor apartments that can look nice, that can look cool, would essentially increase the housing supply without, quote unquote, destroying the character of the neighborhood, and occupies a good in between where we don't have to look at canyons of glass, but also we're not looking at, we're maximizing the land the best that we can. So, empower development and growth divisions, reducing delay, and really simplify the rules and eliminate red tape. So the idea here is to essentially legalize these things being built, ensure that people are incentivized in building those, and not have over consultation or drawn out appeals. Not have tons of people constantly complaining about these things going up, because people just constantly complain about all sorts of things, and honestly, these things should just be built to improve the housing supply. So the bail compliance is an interesting idea. So the idea is that 8 new officers with an average of 4 per Toronto 17 police divisions. So these officers would be exclusively tasked with enforcing compliance with those who are released on bail. So there's over 1,500 individuals who are released on bail with very strict conditions like curfews and house arrest. So the idea is that these 8 new officers would ensure that these people are actually following these bail rules. These are estimated to cost $16 million for its first year. 8 officers, $16 million. And then $10 million annually, and it would be paid for by the government of Ontario with their follow through on the public commitments, public improved safety. So again, the idea here is that this is conditional on the provincial government actually funding this. Again, this is a bit worrying if the provincial government does. This is what it says, would be paid for with their follow through. So this is conditional on the provincial government actually agreeing to go through with this plan, this idea, and they make no changes to it. I'm a bit concerned about the cost. Why do 10 million off? Why does 8 officers cost $10 million? Officers usually get paid about $100,000. Why can't we get more for that money? Where's that money going to? But I imagine that's probably going towards vehicles, equipment, cars, and it might be costed over not just 1 year, but over many years. Again, I'm not too sure. I think more specific on why this amount of money is being spent on this, and really the actual impact on this, and if other jurisdictions have done a similar thing. I don't think it's a bad idea. I think it just needs more information. So you've got transportation. So we've got the Gardner East. So the idea here is that on the Gardner East, he would allow 24-hour a day construction, 7 days a week. Require the construction happening between 9 p.m. and 7 a.m. be no closer than 100 meters from an occupied residential property. The King Streetcar. Divert the Queen Streetcars to the enhanced King Streetcar Express zone between Spadina and Church. Key streetcars of Richmond and Adelaide, maintain the dedicated vehicle lanes, protected cycle lane, use redeployed parking officers to keep traffic moving, prevent more construction chaos, and save money by halting the current plan to install streetcar tracks on Adelaide. Again, I don't know if we shouldn't install streetcar tracks on Adelaide. More public transit usually good. The problem here is, I don't know. I don't think there's a necessarily specific problem here. I think this is just fairly regular. It's downtown focused. I think there needs to be more of a focus on Etobicoke and Scarborough and North York and these kind of other areas, rather than this consistent focus on just this specific downtown area. That's my personal belief, but yeah, I don't know. This is just fairly just meh. There's a lot of focus on a very small area of Toronto. So to contrast Bradford, we've now got Mitzie Hunter. If you'll recall, if you're still with me, the former MPP, now running for city mayor. So her ideas for the safety plan is, social workers paired with transit officers. Community ambassadors is an interesting idea. So the community ambassadors idea is that people at the stations or people living close to the station would be employed as like safety ambassadors, who would then go down into each station at certain times and make safety audits to, check the compliance of these. I don't know how effective that is. I don't know how that's better than just having transit enforcement officers, hanging out. I get the idea of this is to, create a more community safety focused aspect of that. But I don't know if that is as effective or more effective than just spending that money on hiring more transit officers who are dedicated to safety 24/7 on the transit, rather than community ambassadors who work there out of a sense of desire for their community. I don't know how professional and how capable they're going to be compared to just regular officers who are trained for safety. And, what if someone stabs a community ambassador? What if there's like a crazy dude on something, like, what happens then? I don't know if we should be putting citizens in that kind of line of fire. Not that the TTC is that kind of war zone or that dangerous or anything like that. I think in an ideal world, in a communal kind of world, that makes a lot of sense. I don't know the effectiveness of this. I think there needs to be more research done. So again, glass sliding doors, same thing as Bradford. Listening to writers, just more polls and suggestions and that kind of thing. Listening to TTC staff, again, more political, listening to people and seeing what they have to say and that kind of stuff. There's nothing super substantial there, I don't think, at least. So in terms of climate resilience, so the position of Chief Resiliency Officer, so a residential flood protection program, extreme heat protection program. So essentially this is to provide funding and information to prevent flooding, and funding information for extreme heat, so cooling centers, that kind of stuff. In the summer, Toronto does get very hot, and often there are floods from heavy rain. So, this seems to be within the purview of the city. But again, this isn't like a direct infrastructure project that you can see. This is yet another kind of invisible program that only comes to life when problems occur. And then I think there may be some political problems in terms of selling this to voters who can't really directly see the impacts of a flood if we haven't had a flood in like years, things like that. So, I mean, overall, fine. Well, whatever. Chief Resiliency Officer, I don't know what they would do. What is the goal of this person? Like, would they just be like a climate expert, and their goal would then be implement climate strategies to prevent things? I don't know. I'm sure we can kind of squeeze that in some urban planner. I don't really see if they need a whole department to handle that. But again, I don't know. But you can educate me if I'm uninformed on that front. Ontario Place makes a return. So there's three key things that Mitzie Hunter talks about: is public space, affordability, and beautiful space. So public space must be preserved and enhanced. Vague. Don't really know what that means. Ontario Place must be affordable and accessible. What does affordable mean? What does accessible mean? Its geographical location is fairly central in the city of Toronto. It's pretty accessible by GO lines and subways and by walking. So I guess that's already ticked off. I don't know what affordable means. Affordable in relation to what? In relation to what income? How, a free park is affordable to everybody, but is a $10 theme park affordable to many? I don't know what that means. Beautiful space that's a magnet for tourism. So now we have two goals. So the goal should be like it's a beautiful place, so it should be something that is worth looking at, but also that people from around the world would visit it. I don't ever think Ontario Place is going to be an equivalent to the pyramids or the Louvre in Paris. But I get the vision and the idealism behind this. Again, this is just a vague plan, and I think there's more specifics in what this means for people. I think Mitzie Hunter's got some pretty solid plans. So it relies on reducing homelessness by increasing housing stability, and reducing homelessness by investing more in different institutions and structures to ensure that people, have good jobs, good money, and that kind of stuff. Raising mental wellness, there's a lot of focus on mental health and mental illness, and breaking the homelessness cycle by ensuring that people have access to solid homes and communities. And you're doing this through a community and nonprofit organization kind of focus. So I think a lot of that stuff just makes sense. That's perfectly fine. It seems fairly boilerplate in terms of like what the ideas are going to be. Invest more, do more, create an organization or an agency, that kind of stuff. It's an important issue, and I think that's gonna be fine. Yeah. Spaces idea is essentially creating more safe spaces for young people. So using the Toronto Public Libraries, working with schools, that kind of thing, helping close the digital divide. The Connectio is interesting in that she wants to create a broadband service in Toronto that would offer low-cost internet for people in Toronto. So I imagine this would compete with Robellus and these other major telecom providers. So overall, I think that's an interesting idea. I think, again, we just need more information on how that's going to be implemented, how much are we going to spend on it, who is it going to benefit, will this be for all of Toronto, that kind of thing. Extend Sunday service. That sounds like a church thing, but no, it means extending Sunday service at the libraries from 11 to 5. And for outdoor patios, they want to cancel and refund the 2023 permit fees for Cafe TO and abolish the application fees. So we look at the fees versus the economic benefits. So we see that the fees brought in, I think Mitzie Hunter is quoted at like $2 or $3 million of city money, but the economic benefits led to hundreds of millions of dollars of people spending more money at cafes, hanging out more in cities, being more on the sidewalk, frequenting local businesses, which goes to show that these cafes blocking up a lane of the road contributes to economic benefits far more than this lane of road contributes to being available for cars. A hint to Mark Saunders, who should take a look at the Cafe TO programs to see the success of that. So yeah, um, the economic benefits of this being more walkable, more interesting for people to hang out with, bikes, cafes, makes a lot more sense than having this one lane open for more cars to race down here. Yeah, so we already see it even in Mitzie's idea here. So free fares for seniors and users of Wheel-Trans. So this is the Wheel-Trans bus, often used by disabled people to get to where they need to go. Reversing the TTC fare hikes, fully funding the TTC's operational costs. I think this can be huge, considering that the majority of the TTC's funding comes from Farebox. So that what that means is that the majority of the funding comes from fares that you pay. So when there's lower ridership, less fares are coming in, which means less money can be spent on service, which means that less people are inclined to take the TTC because the service is worse. So therefore, this creates kind of this death spiral. So fully funding the TTC, I think, is important to ensure the quality is maintained, and then more people can come back. So it's like this: you got to invest it so that people can show up and realize that, like, yeah, this is worth going on, rather than the death spiral, which is the alternative. Again, huge project, the Eglinton East LRT, we talked about that, we saw that on the previous map. The Waterfront East LRT, the Shepherd Subway, additional Cummer Station to serve North York, ignore the misspelling of York. Yeah, unfortunately named, but again, more stations, Shepherd West Subway Station, fully funded busway, all that kind of stuff. So these are just like major transit ideas in order to solve it. Again, this needs to be talked with the province about the Metrolinx and the TTC thing, no more dual fares. But other than that, everything else seems to be fairly regular, but will just take a lot of money to do. But I think it's important to be ambitious in a lot of these plans, and Toronto needs a transit. This is interesting. The free fares for seniors. So I imagine this would then contribute to ridership. More people using the thing. That would justify more funding, so on and so forth. Mental health is difficult because it is a bit of an abstract concept. It's kind of hard to quantify how successful certain mental health policies are. You can definitely see people having mental health crises, but it's hard to, it's not really an economic kind of thing. You can see like how much you spent has led to X amount of success. So they're going to hire a chief mental health officer. Again, more executives and more budget to do what exactly? I guess to be in charge of the mental health support strategy, long-term comprehensive mental health addiction strategy, increasing the community service partnership, creating a technology fund to modernize integration. Again, this is supporting some of the issues that the city has had with managing mental health, and really a lot of people that have had mental health issues are not able to get the support and the access they need because we've closed down a lot of the facilities and we've underfunded a lot of these programs. So I think more funding to these programs, more interventions in the city, and more access to certain programs I think is going to be really critical. So I think this is fine. I think, again, we just need to be more specific in terms of how exactly we're going to achieve this and what does success mean. And I think this needs to be paired with a anti-homelessness strategy, which was earlier, paired with a TTC safety strategy earlier. None of these exist in a vacuum. So all of this combined, I think, could be, something is better than nothing. And I think this could be an improvement to what is currently lacking in the city. So I think this is perfectly okay. I think just needs to be more specifics on like exactly how this is going to be funded and all that kind of stuff. So in summary, out of the 6 candidates, Toronto has quite a few options, and I think it's important to note that the direction of the city is in your hands. I think all of you, after seeing this video, should at least register to vote and check it out, and vote for somebody that you think aligns with your values and your beliefs and your vision of the city afterwards. If you're frustrated by Tory's lack of ambition or lack of doing anything, I think it's a good time to vote for somebody that you think will actually do some exciting things for the city. And the direction of the city is in your hand. Being ambivalent or not really caring about it and then complaining about it later is just a silly thing to do. You've got a unique opportunity to re-vote and rechange the direction of the city. So I would do it. I'd go for it. So my personal observations are that many candidates seem to be stuck in the between of attempting to do either two big projects or two small projects. So the projects are either too big and they require, federal funding or provincial funding, or they're too small and they really don't matter in the grand scheme of things of the city. I think focusing on medium city-sized projects, there's plenty of them, but I'm a bit worried if we get bogged down in the vanity or unrealistic ones. Like if we get too worried about the Ontario Science Centre and don't focus on the massive transit projects and don't focus on the massive housing projects, is the Ontario Science Centre really worth focusing on over, the 7 LRT lines or like the 20,000 units of housing that we need to build? Things like that. Personally, I think the main priorities really should be affordable housing and what the mayor within their purview can do about it, affordable and high quality transit, what the mayor and their purview can do about it, which in turn then makes more housing viable. If you're able to commute further distances without needing a car, that opens up a lot more potential for businesses opening up, that opens a lot more potential for employment, that opens a lot more potential for cheaper housing, all that kind of stuff. And then opportunity for growth. How do we contribute to ensuring that people in the city are able to access good quality jobs, they're able to contribute to their careers, they're able to do things to facilitate their future in the city. Personally, I think a mix of Hunter's mental health and TTC focuses, Bailao's housing and highways, Matlow's community focus, and Chow's organization would be the ideal mix. Hunter's got a great program on mental health and the TTC and kind of focusing on those massive expansion projects. Bailao uploading the highway and housing ideas, to reduce those costs. Matlow's community focus, a lot of Matlow's ideas I think would be extremely successful. More TTC stuff, looking at expanding community organizations, looking at like the open schools TO kind of thing. Those are great ideas. And then Chow's focus on nonprofits and organizations to essentially run a lot of these facilities, I think would be great. I don't think the other candidates offer anything that would be super. That would lead the city on a trajectory that I think would be successful in terms of contributing to affordable housing, affordable transit, and opportunity to growth. And my final point is that high quality cities attract people. If we build a city that can actually facilitate all of these things, I think we're going to get a lot more people that will come, obviously, but we will need to be able to house them and ensure that they have good opportunities, and that'll often lead to the prosperity and the success of Toronto. If we're able to hit these key points and make Toronto much more affordable to live in, then I think we could become one of the most ideal cities in the world, if not hopefully one of the best in North America.